Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you to the Society for inviting me. Just say a word about very brief word about my collaborators. Aude Bicollet received her doctorate about 6 years ago from the University of Essex, and she's currently a postdoctoral research fellow and course tutor in the Department of Methodology at the LSE. And her main research interests include computer-assisted textual analysis, qualitative research, and more substantively, public policy and comparative politics. And Vasiliki Tsakroni received her doctorate this year from Queen Mary. Her research is in the area of political communication and the use of marketing and branding in politics, and she focuses on the interaction between communication strategies and political parties. And interestingly, after I'd agreed the title of the presentation with Duncan, it generated an enormous semi-philosophical discussion about what do we actually mean by text and data mining. And I'll take this opportunity to tell you I and my collaborators are users of text mining and particularly text analysis software packages. And this comes from a long tradition of doing manual text analysis using coding frames and all sorts of other things. And I'll explain a little bit about how we've got to where we are today within my discipline of political science in a couple of minutes. So Aude particularly questioned whether we were actually doing anything alternative at all. But I think really the alternativeness, if I can put it like that, comes in the way in which we're using it. So I am unashamedly a user, and I'm unashamedly going to talk to you qualitatively about what these wonderful methods have actually produced. And it's an enormous amount of material. We start with an enormous amount of material, but when we distilled it, we actually discovered we've got huge amounts of data that we can play with over a very long period of time. So I just... it works. I want to say a few words about the broader project and where this presentation fits into it. The research project, which is fairly obviously, by sort of given my title, is supported by a fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust, to whom we are very grateful. In large part, it's an investigation of how the debate on the regulation of MPs' expenses and allowances has been framed over time. And this presentation is, in fact, a snapshot, well, it's perhaps rather a blown-up snapshot because it concentrates on what we have chosen to regard as our key debate, and that is the debate of the 29th of June 2009, which was the second reading debate on the Parliamentary Bill to establish the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which I'll henceforth refer to as IPSA. And the second reading debate is the most useful type of debate to analyse in this sort of context. I mean, I and several other people have done this before, because it is actually the bill in sort of its first form. First reading, it really just reads out the title and the principles, but this is the first real debate before any amendments are brought in. So you can actually see, in this case it was the government that introduced it, but it wasn't a public policy bill. It was very much almost a moral issue, and I'll come on to that in a moment as well. But you can see exactly what the progenitors of the debate are actually trying to get at, what they're trying to do. The way in which we establish our analysis is to seek out dimensions. What are the dimensions that frame this debate? What is the nature of the language? Can we group it? Can we group the language into particular clusters, if you like? Can we identify these being similar over time? And it really represents a method of data mining which has been growing quite considerably for researchers in political science over the past 30 years or so. So what I'm going to talk about today is, firstly, briefly, questions that I've raised in the wider project, a little bit about text analysis in political science, the particular methodology that we're using, two packages. Qualitative, this is essentially, well, it's entirely qualitative. There might be a bit of quantitative analysis later on down the line. But what sort of qualitative CATA, computer-assisted text analysis, are we using? There are two packages, which I'll come to in a minute. A little bit about the results of analysis on this debate, and a few concluding remarks. And I'll just very briefly show you at the end how this fits into the broader project across time. Okay, so what are the questions for the project? The main question, I suppose, is there a particular kind of language or discourse or rhetoric relating to this area of parliamentary deliberation, and is it robust over time? How does Parliament operate in terms of providing an arena that's appropriate, the exchanging of views, for example, on the financial probity of MPs? Does partisanship play any role? Does it matter which party you come from when you get up to speak in a debate like this? You know, it's not this was not a whip debate. In fact, there was almost no dissension whatsoever when it came to voting. Can we actually learn anything in terms of how parties, despite this, in terms of how party protagonists actually frame their rhetoric, frame the way in which they're trying to make points in Parliament? Do they actually represent particular approaches to problem solving? And what reforms have been introduced since 2009 which regulate MPs' expenses and or make the House of Commons more inclusive, more transparent, you know, etc. and so forth? And these two particular types of methodology are employed in answering these questions. With regard to presentation, to this presentation, the focus is on the first question and the method used, which is computer-assisted text analysis. I should say at this point, we are actually engaging in other sorts of methodology in other bits of the project. For example, a survey of members of Parliament, particular groups of members of Parliament, talking to parliamentary officials, talking to academics who are specialised in the field, and so on and so forth. The research focuses on the analysis of the content of arguments. I am essentially a content analyst. These are the arguments that are put forward in debates overall, as well as by the individual MPs contributing to the debates. Now, there are varying numbers of MPs who speak in the debates. Some speak a lot, some speak a little. For example, in the 29th of June debate that I'm going to talk about, the largest number of words spoken by the person who intervened most, unsurprisingly speaking on behalf of the government, was Jack Straw, and he used 5,788 words. The lowest intervention was by the MP Bridget Prentice, who used only 13 words. But actually what she said was quite significant and quite important. So, you know, this actually has an impact on the particular type of software that you can use. If you want to analyse very small interventions, you cannot use every type of software because it just can't cope with it. Reports of select committees are also looked at. I haven't analysed these yet really at all, so I'm not going to say anything about them. And we're seeking to determine really whether there is an underlying language, an underlying set of vocabularies, if you like, which are used in the deliberations on these topics over time, both in terms of debates and select committee reports. So I'll say a little bit about text analysis in political science. And it first really started in the 1930s in the States, and it was first sort of examined from the point of view of communications. In 1930, an analysis of newspaper content was undertaken, and this was for the purpose of actually looking at which particular categories newspapers dwelt on. You know, what did they most emphasise? Was it politics? Was it sort of social affairs? Was it advertising? And so on and so forth. Now, the methodology used here was very interesting. It's obviously terribly quaint to us because they literally took a ruler and measured column inches devoted to particular topics. They sort of blocked them out and then just simply measured them. This led on to something a little more scientific. There's a famous political scientist called Harold Lasswell, who was really a scholar who devoted most of his life to analysing power and leadership. But he also took a sort of psychological approach to this, you know, what makes a good leader and what makes a bad leader type of thing, and how do they utilise power, and one of his most famous books was Power and Personality. So in the late 1930s, he was drafted in by the US government to undertake and lead the World Attention Survey. And what the World Attention Survey was all about was whether or not the newspapers were sort of increasingly talking about the likelihood of war, and they were particularly interested in looking at European newspapers, particularly French, British, German and Soviet. And what they actually, one of the things they actually in effect predicted was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1938 between Stalin and Hitler, because of the way in which references to hostilities between the two countries diminished both in the German press and in Pravda. Bernard Berelson was another sort of key analyst in this. He was one of the first people to undertake what's now been dubbed psephology, the analysis of electoral behaviour, 1944 and 1948. And he used content analysis mostly to analyse the answers to survey questions. But nevertheless, he got into it more and more and started analysing political documents. In the 1950s and early 60s, work began on the development of what, for political scientists, was the first major piece of software, coming from the United States, but encompassing work by political scientists from other countries, particularly Britain. And that was looking at the speeches of politicians, particularly leading up to elections, particularly, for example, in the United States, in terms of the candidacy of different individuals who wished to stand as either Republican or Democratic candidate for the presidency, and so on and so forth. This, jumping ahead to the early 1980s, led to the Manifesto Project. Now, the Manifesto Project was actually something that didn't use software. It was actually an analysis of party manifestos, firstly in Britain and the United States. It began with the work of a man called David Robertson, who's at St Hugh's College, Oxford. Now, and he actually he read in great detail every party manifesto in Britain, party platform in America from 1926 onwards, and he's recognised that there are a number of different domains, there are a number of different areas of content that these documents dwelt on, and he decided to set up a framework by means of which to analyse them. The project is now halfway through a massive grant from the German Science Foundation. It's now located at the Science Centre, the Wissenschaftszentrum in Berlin, and it's got a grant of something approaching €1 million over 12 years. So it's really trying to map out and provide a massive data set relating to every party. Its goal is every post-Second World War party manifesto in liberal democracies, and even some that aren't quite liberal democracies across the world. This led to analysing parliamentary debates by people in a number of countries. One of the main protagonists was the Swiss political scientist Jörg Steiner, who says that in analysing parliamentary debates, we should really actually pay more attention to what the MPs and representatives actually say, because as he puts it, quote, talk matters. The nature of speech acts inside legislatures is a function of institutional rules and mechanisms and bears an influence on political outcomes that transcends these rules and mechanisms. Hence, we can identify different aspects or different dimensions of debate. The methodology that we're particularly using for this aspect of the project, as I said, is based on CATA, and there are two forms. The first one is ALPSP. It is a French program developed by Max Reinert at the French National Centre for Scientific Research in Toulouse. My French is terrible, but I will use the translation, analysis of co-occurring lexemes within statements of a text. Hamlet is the other package. This was developed primarily by Alan Breyer of the ESRC, Economic and Social Research Council, National Centre for Research Methods at Southampton University, and by Bruno Hopp of the Gazis Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences at the University of Cologne. Both of these developments enable the counting of words or phrases or sentences from which we can identify specific ideas. And one of our prominent aims is to see whether there is, in fact, a procedural dimension cross-cutting a substantive dimension, procedural dimension which actually takes on board the way in which Parliament works, the sort of thing about my right honourable friend, my right honourable and learned friend, the party opposite, particular phrases associated with Parliament. Now, this has been done, for a lot of parliaments across the world, but I think we could probably get the Nobel Prize for the most arcane language that's sort of been used over time. This was first suggested by the man I mentioned before, Jörg Steiner, but it's been sort of pulled apart and developed over time. So I'll say a very few words about the two software packages. In fact, both of them, not just ALPSP, both of them combine textual and statistical analysis. This was originally developed and applied in the study of humanities, but it's more recently spread to analyse political speeches, parliamentary debates, and even the results of opinion polls. And it relies on the co-occurrence of words and phrases, particularly focusing on the degree of frequency with which they occur in a text or corpus. And within the corpus, subsets of words are identified on the basis of their lexical profile. And as Reinert says himself, this can be used to determine the main word distribution pattern within a text or a discourse. Technical procedure leads to selecting a series of class, each determined by a pool of words mathematically linked together and having the highest significant frequency of occurrence, i.e. those which the speaker tended to use the most repeatedly. These class, with their content and function words, subscribe to the different types of discourse within their specific vocabulary or syntax. In other words, the software is designed to quantify a text in order to extract its most significant features. There are two major assumptions at the core of this. Firstly, the most significant structures are closely linked to the distribution of words in a text. And secondly, that repetition is the main factor for what's called the stabilisation, or identification of discursive activity. So what ALPSP is therefore trying to do is carry out a particular reading of the text which focuses on recurrence and co-occurrence of words in sentence segments. And as such, it then goes on, if you wish, to identify particular speakers with particular vocabularies and use of language. On the surface, especially in terms of its basic co-occurrence searching, seems very similar to the other program, Hamlet. Now, the main purpose of Hamlet is to search a text file for words in a given vocabulary. With ALPSP, there is no human intervention except actually feeding the text into the program. And, if you like, identifying speakers, in this case by party or gender. You don't tell it to do anything in terms of your research question or anything. It will tell you. It's not easy to interpret all the time either. Hamlet, on the other hand, offers a rather different combination of tools. And its main difference is it is up to the analyst to provide the questionnaire, if you like, for the text, to provide a dictionary, to set up a series of categories, feed this in, well, you actually get it to select from the words in the text, to actually then divide the particular text in terms of the vocabulary that you are interested in looking for on the basis of this dictionary of categories. It's very useful in generating lists, including synonyms for using comparative analysis, and it helps the scholar to subdivide the textual material in terms of individual hermeneutic units. In these units, words, phrases, expressions are identified. Now, the units of analysis for this project contain words and phrases identified in the text and reflected back in the established categories. Texts are examined either as a whole, so the debate is examined as a whole, or it can be broken down and examined on the basis of the combined interventions of individual speakers. ALPSP only deals with large texts. You can't have a speaker analysis, certainly in terms of these debates, by using ALPSP, because it just cannot actually deal with it. Just following on from that, the framing of the dictionary for Hamlet, as I've said, the key debate was the 29th of June, and the aim is to establish the dimensional parameters of this debate and then see whether these are, have any resonance for debates either preceding 2009 or following it on similar types of topic. In other words, MPs, expenses, allowances, interests, and so on and so forth. What we find here is that there are, in fact, two particular types of vocabulary, the procedural and the substantive that Steiner suggested, but there is not one single substantive vocabulary. It is divided into 5 different, if you like, sub-vocabularies: advocacy, one dealing, sort of speaking, passionately arguing for a particular approach to solving a problem; ethical vocabulary, vocabulary dealing with finance, unsurprisingly; and institutional vocabulary, because, of course, this is actually a bill about establishing a new institution; and legal implications. Collectively, these comprised sort of 670 different words and phrases and abbreviations. Advocacy contained the most, and financial contained the least. I just should point out, before telling you what we found very quickly, that there are an awful lot of words in these debates, and a lot of them, they're not empty, but they signify sort of common usage, like the, prepositions, adjectives, well, adjectives are quite important sometimes, adverbs, and so on. So you actually get quite a low take-up. Now, this is actually hitting the norm that we've found analysing different types of texts over the years, which is approximately 15% of a large-ish text would be sort of taken up by this vocabulary. So if we want to depict this graphically, we would get everything bunched, and we would see no difference. So the convention has become to actually divide the vocabulary into its component parts, and therefore sort of say, well, this is sort of using 50% of the vocabulary in the text, this is using 10%, and so on. And you can see what we're looking at is the relative difference in terms of the usage of these different vocabularies. Right. Alceste has come up with 5 classes. The first thing that we can note here is that it is a multi-dimensional type of debate, that there is a huge amount of interrelationship between these 5 classes, which we've labelled governance, procedural, representation, and ethics, and administration. These are not significantly different from the ALPSP categories that we projected in our hypothesis. The one that's missing, in a sense, is advocacy. But if you sort of look at this in great detail, then you can actually see that this is scattered about the various 5 classes. And we wouldn't have assumed that this actually sort of mirrored, that the 2 sets of results would mirror each other. Here we have a factor analysis of the ALPSP dimensions. They do cluster around the centre. They do suggest that there's a procedural and a substantive procedural and substantive axes here, and they do suggest that there are different types of vocabulary which are emphasised by different speakers. This is just a reflection of the Hamlet Dictionary. I'll move on to the reflection of the Hamlet Dictionary by party. And the procedural dimension, which is the largest one, is actually there is no difference whatsoever depending on what party you come from. Labour, Liberal, Democrat, Conservative, SDLP or whatever. When we get to the other dimensions, there are slight differences. I mean, for example, with advocacy, which is the blue one, the Liberal Democrats and others emphasise this more than Labour and Conservative. This is not unsurprising because they have more cohesive clientele in many ways than the two larger parties. There were only 3 women speaking in this debate, unfortunately, so we can't give any meaningful sort of differences between men and women, but we can see that there are a few. This is completely unscientific, and we can see, for example, that male MPs are more likely to emphasise procedural vocabulary than female. I'm not going to say anything about these in detail. If we look at the party speakers individually, we can see that there are a huge set of variations. Conservatives more than most. I'll just mention the one Spike. The Spike is the rather maverick independent Bob Spink, who was there at the time. And, you know, his profile was totally different than anybody else, but then it was tended to be totally different than anybody else on any debate whatsoever that took place in the House of Commons that he contributed to. Oops, sorry, one more. What I can show you here is actually, this is 9 debates over time that we're analysing across the project, and in actual fact, the 35-year period, or whatever it is, shows that these vocabularies are relatively robust. I could explain what the 2 peaks are, but I won't. Just concluding remarks, this is simply, of course, a snapshot of one debate, but, you know, and why on earth should it actually tell us anything particular about this? Well, it does tell us some things. It does help us to see that elements of parliamentary debate, that our usual perusal of them in terms of the fisticuffs over Prime Minister's Question Time, for example, actually don't show up. There are a number of interesting dimensions here, a number of interesting features about the way MPs actually frame their contributions to parliamentary debate, which we don't normally see. It's the bit of the iceberg that's hidden, you know, the large part of the iceberg that's hidden. Both the programmes, Alceste and Hamlet, have produced interesting dimensions, or class, as Alceste calls them. And the class and dimensions particularly are utilised quite considerably. Every single sentence unit in the debate contains at least one example of the vocabularies. But of course, neither piece of software can account for 100% of what is contained in the debate. The estimates are important and they add to our understanding of the process. And as I say, and the thing that really pleases me most is that this sort of language, particularly the procedural, but also the substantive, is robust over time. And this is one of the things that we were examining at the outset. Thank you.